Good day, Europe. Good afternoon, the Americas, and good morning or good night, Asia and Australasia. What a prime global forum we've got. My name's Alec Wersun. I'm Associate Professor in Strategy and Corporate Responsibility at Glasgow Caledonian University, the University for the Common Good based in Scotland, the UK. I'm also a member of the Prime Global Chapter Council. Now, I'm delighted to be revisiting the Prime SDG blueprint in this session in the company of three very engaged colleagues from different parts of the world. From Europe, we have Luis Veiga. From the Americas, we have Christiane Molina. And from the African continent, we have Jill Bogie from the Gordon Institute of Business. Now, just to keep you on track, the session is divided into three parts. First of all, I'm trying to share the slides here, Nikolai. First of all, I'm going to give you a potted history of the blueprint and lay that out very briefly. Secondly, I will engage the panelists in some discussion, which we hope you'll find of interest. And thirdly, we will collectively respond to you, the audience, and any questions that you pose in the chat box. So please use that function in order to try and make this interactive. Now, as part of our research on the blueprint, I would kindly ask you if you could complete the single question poll, which we've made available to you, and just hover above the poll box in the top right corner of your screen and answer that question at your convenience. So in brief, the Prime SDG blueprint started work, a team of Prime Champions started work on the blueprint in 2019. And of course, this was 3 years after the launch of the SDGs in 2016. We knew that the Prime community was actively exploring how to integrate the SDGs into educational activities. So the purpose of this document was to do some research and develop some concepts and frameworks based on what colleagues around the world were doing in order to provide a guide to deepen the SDG integration process and also help colleagues who were starting the journey of doing it to be able to make it more strategic. So I'd like to stress at the outset that the Prime SDG blueprint is a practical guide to help universities and business schools to integrate the SDGs into all activities, whether that's education, curriculum, research, and partnerships. Now, of course, while we are covering SDGs in totality, we can remind ourselves of SDG target 4.7. And that demands that we as educators really ensure that all our learners acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development. And there are a number of topics that are actually embraced in that definition. Now, the blueprint and executive summary of it and a set of narrated slides are available on the Prime Resource website. So after this, if you haven't already got it, please go download it and share it. Now, at the heart of the SDG blueprint is the SDG compass. And based on what we found colleagues are actually doing, we've developed this framework which outlines a simple 4-step process that can guide teams of colleagues in business schools setting about the task of strategic integration of the SDGs into educational activity. The 4 steps can be seen on this screen. Understanding where we are is the first step. Defining priorities and setting goals, the second. Deepening and broadening integration, the third. And communicating the findings, is the fourth. Now, in a bit more detail and very briefly, let's stress at the outset that SDG integration is a strategic initiative, and it's a journey. It's not going to happen overnight. It takes time. Colleagues have been working on this for 3, 4, 5 years. And of course, the target is to have achieved this by 2030 at the very latest. But as we can see from this slide, it needs participation and support from the top, from the senior management group, but also from fellow colleagues. The 4 steps, we always start with understanding where we are. And to do this, we need to actually define mapping. Now, the purpose of a mapping is really undertaking a basic kind of audit. And we can do this in a number of ways. If we were totally ambitious, we could do it across the whole business school. We could do it in curriculum. We could do it in research. We could do it in partnerships. But what we're finding is that colleagues may be limited in resources. So they might start with mapping in the curriculum, or start with mapping in the research, or start with mapping in partnerships, and then expand the process. Now, this audit then, and this mapping process can be done in one of 3 ways, and they vary by degree of complexity. The first step is mapping by icon, simply looking at the icon, no poverty or well-being or gender equality, and simply associating the content of curriculum or research with that particular icon. More specifically, one can use an intermediate type of mapping, which looks at UN keywords. So we use artificial intelligence, about 15 words for each SDG, and we can run it through an Excel spreadsheet or some other sort of AI, and we can identify where these words actually appear in a module or a course catalogue. And the most complex form of mapping is when we map against the SDG targets, because if we're going to get deeper into it, we need to understand what these targets are. Now, once we've done the audit, we can identify strengths and weaknesses, and we can identify where the gaps are. So the second stage of the SDG compass is to set ourselves targets, to say where we're actually going to invest resources to fill gaps in the curriculum or research or partnerships. And that takes us to step 2. Now, we can do this in research, we can do it in curriculum, or we can do it across the whole business school. So the SDG blueprint offers a guide of how we can do it. So for example, with SDG integration in the business school, what we're finding is that different business schools have different research centers. Some of them may be focused on a single SDG, primarily like gender equality or poverty, accepting that these things are all interconnected. And others may look at a center for sustainable development. So research may be all embracing. And after curriculum and research, there is a guide on SDG partnerships. So we found that partnerships can be undertaken for teaching purposes, in other words, dealing with corporates. It can be undertaken for research purposes, or it can be undertaken on community-oriented projects. Now, that's a very rough and ready walk through the blueprint. It's available on the Prime website. And dear colleagues here on the panel, it's all very simple, isn't it? How do you use this blueprint? Could I start perhaps with Jill here? How do you use this blueprint?
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for the introduction to the blueprint, Alec. I worked with Alec on the development of the blueprint along with a group of colleagues. And first of all, I'd like to say that I use it in a number of different ways because I think it's got multiple uses. And while at the school I'm with, Gordon Institute of Business Science, I think we are part of the way along the journey. As you get more involved, you find that you've got further to go and you keep learning and you keep developing. But I find that when I first joined GIBS, that something like the blueprint would have been really useful. It helps to understand the rationale for using and for the whole idea of integrating the SDGs and the background to Prime. So if you're starting off, I think it provides you with that. But it also helps those that are part of the way along the process and those that are quite well developed. And I think that that's very useful, and it therefore continues to be useful to GIBS as well as to myself and colleagues who are working with it. I think the second thing is, and my favorite part is actually the section that Alec has just described, which is the SDG Compass, because the SDG Compass is really the essence of the process of integration and has those iterative steps. And so that is a really good point of departure when you're communicating to colleagues, when you're trying to actually develop from where you are and taking it a step further. And then the practical examples are always useful to delve into. Having helped to develop some of the examples that are in the blueprint, I'm always on the lookout for new ones. So I like to share from that point of view. But I specifically have used that SDG Compass. It's in the GIBS SIP report. I think it's a good starting point, and I recommend you use the SDG blueprint by using it as a point of view, not as something you need to cover. And that's how I use it. I find that particularly useful.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jill, for that introduction. Christiane, what about down in Mexico and the Americas there? How are you using it in your school?
Thank you, Alec, and it's great to be here with such wonderful colleagues. I think it was great to prepare for this panel together. So let me tell you, well, that I feel kind of new to the Prime family. As you probably know, I joined and I started working with Prime a little bit before the pandemic started. So it's been like around 2 years in this journey, as you mentioned. So for me, it's an opportunity to perhaps take a critical perspective to what we are doing in our school, and the blueprint can help us to identify what we are missing, right? And what can we do better and enhance with all these processes that were mentioned. So I think it provides us with a structure, with a foundation to start also adapting to our local context, which I think is mentioned throughout the blueprint, and we need to stress, right? Because as you said, we need to adapt to the different resources available to all the specifics of each country, right? So in my case, I think it's going to help me understand what can we improve, what are the things that we need to perhaps give more formality in terms of the processes, and I think it helps us plan for the upcoming years.
Well, thank you, Christiane. What about you, Lewis? I mean, this document, it's supposed to be a practical document and guidance. How are you finding that and using it?
Thank you, Alec, and it's a great pleasure for me to participate in this panel with my colleagues and with everybody. So, as you said, it should be a practical book, and SDG, as we like to call it, is also a new language. So it's a new language that we all should use. And let me try to give that image. This blueprint is like a kind of the grammar where you can interpret the different SDGs, the main purpose, and how is important for the business schools. So basically, we use that as a tool, not only to help us in our SDG journey by doing several audits that we need to do, but also choose some good examples and good practices to implement in our school's life. So it has been a very fantastic tool, but also to show to the other people, to the faculty, to the staff, that it's not something completely, it's something difficult. No, it's a common language. So, and I think the way it was written, the way it is presented, I think is a very useful and practical tool, as you were saying, Alec. And that's the way we are using this SDG grammar as a grammar.
Great. I mean, Christiane, could I move to you? A couple of you have mentioned, sharing it with colleagues and the like. How do you engage colleagues with this, with the blueprint? Is that an easy task, or is it challenging?
Now that you were presenting, actually, I think that we need to be more proactive, because perhaps just sharing it, like maybe through emails or pointing out that where to download it, is not enough, right? I think perhaps going through discussion, and I got the idea of having perhaps some small session like you did with a brief explanation. We have, for example, sessions that we call the cafes, right? And it's like every Thursday, every two weeks, right? So I think it is not just about like just pointing out that where the resources are and perhaps sending and sharing, but having perhaps some informal spaces where you can discuss and maybe connect then the contents of this amazing document and blueprint to the actual, let's say, intentions and values of our colleagues in our schools, right? So I think there's a lot more to be done, right? But I am writing also my homework today and perhaps prepare for these cafes to have some kind of conversation after some brief presentation of the blueprint.
Thank you, Christiane. I mean, I love that idea of having like an SDG integration cafe workshop or something. I think that's a really great idea. Jill, I mean, what about challenges in doing this and using this document, or sharing it, getting others to engage with it? What's your experience of that?
Alec, I would like to reflect back on what Luis was saying in terms of language, and I was interested that he talked about it as being the book of grammar. I also think language is a very key issue, something I learned quite early on in trying to work with the prime principles, is that I therefore use, if I can just preface that with the fact that that it gives, whether it's myself or it's the dean or it's my colleagues that are directly involved in prime, we work with it as a strategic document, so that we're aligning the prime principles with the strategy of the school. So it's not necessarily a document in itself that we would share with a wide audience of faculty. It's really direct connection to the strategy to confirm the alignment, not just the direction, but what we're actually, how we execute that strategy, which is the school strategy. So the language for me is important because, and this is something that I experienced when I was doing GRI reporting in a corporate environment, and I think it's very similar in prime, that the language that is used by faculty, the language that is used by administration people, and even the language that we need for our external reporting to accreditation agencies and rating agencies is not identical to the prime language, and it doesn't need to be. It doesn't necessarily need to be directly the same words in terms of every SDG. And after all, many business schools, including ourselves, were doing a lot in the way of sustainability before the SDGs were even published, even before the MDGs. And therefore, I find that there's a translation to be done between prime and accreditation and other external communication and the school strategy. And that's where I find the blueprint very useful, is this translation. And once I understood that, my communication with faculty and administration takes on a different guise. It means something different, so that I don't try and change their language. I try and be the translator of these requirements and make sure that the school strategy is expressed in a way that is understood by our students, our faculty, our administrators, and yet that it is aligned to Prime, and that's where I think the blueprint is really useful strategically, as well as executing the strategy. I'm
Right.
quite happy to discuss that further. I'm maybe taking a slightly different view there, but
no,
yeah.
I think that's great, Jill. And so, in addition to it being practical, you know, you seem to be saying that this is can be used as a strategic part of a strategic toolkit. It's not a standalone document, but it could be a line. That sounds to me a bit like an opportunity. Christiane, you know, opportunities. What opportunities does SDG integration, but also, you know, the blueprint as a guide to doing that, what does it offer schools like EGADE and colleague schools around the world?
Yes, and perhaps I would like to start with one thing that I noticed also in terms of the obstacles, right? Like following Jill's comments, right? In my case, it's not about perhaps the language, but how do you like align the commitment of all at all the different levels that you just mentioned, right? At the top level, at the leadership level, at the department level, and also at the individual, let's say faculty, but also all the people that work in our institutions, right? So I've seen a lot of commitment, and that is also, I think, one thing that unites us. In our Latin American chapter, there's a lot of passion about the topic and everything, right? So how do we align? Because sometimes what you see is that you see individuals, right? And this is also something that is mentioned in the blueprint. Like individual efforts, obviously they have impact. However, when you have more and more people working together collectively to attain and try to attain the objectives set up by the SDGs, I think is going to be more relevant for society, right? So I believe that there's a lot to be done to align these efforts. But for me, one opportunity also comes from the context, right? Because, and there were some other sessions today talking about the incentives, for example, for research, but let's say at the wider university or business school level, I think that what's happening with the accreditation bodies, this is something that is mentioned and repeated across different let's say contexts or organizations. So I think that this is an opportunity that we can grasp, because the accreditation bodies are more and more asking for business schools to have more impact and to also like study and analyze what is their actual impact, not only the one that we were perhaps used to before, like what happens in the classrooms, but what happens beyond the walls of the business school itself, right? So for me, that is a very good opportunity to grasp, because I think that can help us perhaps unite and align all the commitments from the individual faculty members to the leadership and all the people involved in the business school. Just to give you an idea, we are preparing, for example, for the accreditation, re-accreditation with AACSB, right? And we're working on Standard 9, and it helps us also through another methodology understand where we are in terms of all these activities, curricula design, scholarships, including research and outreach for each one of the SDGs, right? So I think we can also take these opportunities and combine to the suggestions and recommendations of the blueprint to help us propel forward and do more, even beyond the walls of the schools, as I said before.
Yeah. Thank you, Christiane. I mean, in addition to that, you're talking about alignment, commitment across different departments. All of our business schools or schools of management have different departments, different disciplines, economics, marketing. Some of it's still siloed, organized in that way. Lewis, can I ask you, how do you achieve this sort of, if you like, shared vision across different disciplines? Because colleagues seem to also be telling us that it's easier to connect certain topics to SDGs and more difficult in others. You're working at that also strategic level. What's your experience of the challenges, or is it an opportunity of pulling people together around this?
Yes, yes, it's an opportunity, and clearly we should address this subject about the SDGs, about blueprint. But let's now focus on the SDGs. like in the case of this, when you talk about sustainability, it should not be a project, it should not be a department, it should not be an area of a business school. It should be part of a business school. It should be part of the all schools, and that's what we try to do. We at Nova SPE, that's what we've been doing. Okay, to have SDGs across in of everything that we are doing, and we started by building awareness and the engagement of the community. So very similar to what Christiane was saying, we organize workshops with faculty and with staff, just to explain to them that it is something that they've been doing for quite a long time, like Jill was saying. So it's not something complete a new wheel that has been invented. No, we are already addressing the challenges of the SDGs for quite a long time. So now we can talk in a different language. So that's what we did. So that's how we starting engaging the whole community. And in terms of the faculty, and before that, and this is part of also of the strategy of the school. It's a top-down, okay? So it's not something that there's a Louise who is running that department that is running that and it likes to implement that. Okay, so it's a top-down. So, but after these workshops, we started communicating SDGs in the different activities we organizing at school. Okay, so now we have the whole community. When, for example, in case of an event, they mention which SDG that event is addressing. So we started creating this common language, and we don't need to be involved in certain cases. People proactively start doing, okay, this is addressing this SDG. In terms of, and as it is a recommendation and it's something that is included in the blueprint, we check all the different courses, what kind of SDG was addressing. And then we went with our analysis to the faculty members and saying, okay, this is our conclusion. This was our conclusion. Do you agree with that? Or do you want to add something here? And that's step by step, because as it was saying, it's a medium and long-term objective. We are talking about 2030. So it's something that we cannot reach with a decree law or with doing like this. So we need to persuade, we need to convince, we need to engage the different faculty members for this new language, which could be also be present in the content of a course without mentioning SDG number X, Y, or Z. But at least in terms of the content, you are addressing the challenges of sustainable development. So this is what has been our experience, awareness by this walk the talk, and then in terms of the impact and in terms of the reporting. So this has been our journey to and having again the SDG blueprint as a tool, a book of grammar.
Great. Well, I mean, I love what you're saying, because in a way there you've captured aspects of the blueprint in terms of understanding, creating awareness of where you are and asking colleagues, do they agree with what you've actually found through your mapping exercise or your audit or whatever you want to call it. And then moving from there, setting targets, not the easiest of tasks. Is there anything you could add on target setting for SDG integration, Christiane?
Yes.
So maybe for research, for targeting curriculum, and within that, identifying areas that you're strong in or weaker in, and areas that need filling.
So are you referring to what are the SDGs, or how is our approach to aligning that?
How would you approach that in terms of identifying gaps or identifying strengths? Because it's a continuous improvement process. And step 4 of the SDG compass talks about communicating and then improving. So the 4-step cycle of the SDG compass is a virtual one. How do you keep the thing going and keep momentum going?
Yes.
here.
Yeah, thank you, Alec, for the clarification. So for us, we are at a point, as I said, that where we are preparing all this analysis of what we are doing in all the activities of the schools, right? And we're doing it by SDGs. I think that, for instance, one thing that we could do in the future would be to add the levels dimension, right? So maybe like having a three-dimensional type of assessment of where we are for each SDG, but also for the levels, right? And across the activities, right? That is a first step, right? And it is, as you said, very clear once you have started mapping where you find the let's say the holes, and it could be like, for instance, in one of the lines of work of the school, right? For me, it was something interesting to find that there's a lot to be done in terms of diversity. For example, we have done some things and gender inclusion and everything. However, we need to do more in terms of our organizational practices, for instance, right? So I think that having a very clear map, but perhaps adding this the third layer, let's say, right, which would be like the SDGs plus the levels plus the activities, so that we can find in which of these areas do we have some spots that we can work on, right? And I think that's a little bit of our approach. But perhaps one thing I can mention is one obstacle that I found, and it is about one of the steps that talks about the continuous data collection, right? Perhaps I think it's kind of easier, and now with the accreditations, as I mentioned, it's going to be critical for schools to do the mapping, right? However, sometimes I believe because of also the speed of things, sometimes we are collecting all this data just for the certain reports that we do annually or every 2 years, and then we lose sight of what we need to do more frequently. So I think that there's a lot to be done in terms of making it more frequent and more continuous follow-up of all these different areas of opportunity that we find in our activities.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to just pause and take a question. I've got a question here that I'd like to read out for the panelists as well, and then maybe I'll invite Jill to start off. And the question is from Alec van Rossum, and she's asking, are there clear guidelines how one can exactly define the SDGs related to your classes? I suppose this connects to the mapping question. You know, how do we help colleagues to do that stage one, understanding where we are? Because some of us have found in the past, talking to colleagues, we say, oh, you know, have you done your SDG about? Oh, no, but don't you teach gender equality? Oh, it's SDG 5, and they're not connected. They're not making that connection clear. Jill, what's your take on this? How can we help Alec from our experiences and yours, very briefly, and then I'll take Lewis on the same question.
Okay, thanks, Alec. I do think the mapping is really useful to communicate that there are different ways, as you have said, that you could do a fairly simple mapping against the SDG and you know, gender equality, SDG 5. You know, it doesn't need a lot of translation, but actually, as you develop and become, I think, more mature in terms of the integration and the use of the SDGs, you really do need to get to what you have. What the blueprint actually says is more complex, but for me, it's more useful to do it at target level. Now, we've been working on this since 2009, so this is, you know, well into our process, and I'm currently grappling with getting it to target level, and have been trying to borrow ideas from some of the schools that are already using target level, and I'm really trying to work it out myself as to how do you translate and map at a target level so that it becomes more specific and it becomes more meaningful and it becomes more tangible for faculty particularly, but also in terms of our reporting to make it more granular. So I think that's where the SDG blueprint is particularly useful, because it demonstrates that you can go from the basics to and develop over time. So I think it's in that mapping, the different mapping tools, and some of them are mentioned in the toolkit and the blueprint as well. So that would be my answer to Alec in terms of how do you bridge that gap with administration and help faculty.
I could just come in before speaking to asking Lewis here is maybe as we develop the blueprint, we could perhaps develop some ideas of discipline areas and which sort of topics within a discipline area might connect to which SDGs, because that seems to be what's behind Annick van Rossum's question, which says, are there clear guidelines how one can exactly define the SDGs related to your classes? And I'm understanding Annick asking there, you know, if you're in a marketing class, or if you're in an economics class, or if you're in a supply chain management class, or if you're in a, I don't know, inclusion class, you know, which SDGs are most closely related. Lewis, what would be your take on that?
Okay, I think, and it was mentioned on your presentation, first presentation, in terms of how to do that is keywords, for example. But sometimes it's not, and I'm going to share our experience. Is we went through all the syllabi for each individual course with keywords, and sometimes we had certain doubts. So we asked to the faculty to show us the content of the course, and we had very good surprises. Okay, by analyzing the content of each individual course. So that's the way we did, and we were not aiming to have an SDG for each individual course. Okay, there are certain ones which you are not addressing in a specific SDG. Okay, probably you can do it in a different way. It's examples that you use in such more technical courses. Use examples of some of the challenges that we are confronted today in terms of sustainable development. Okay, so that's a different way to tackle and to try to reach the same objective. So the syllabus of the course, then the content to double check, and have very good surprises or disappointments. But we have more good surprises than disappointments, and then have this objective, keeping in mind that not all disciplines should be addressing one specific SDG.
Good point. Well, thank you, Lewis. And I think it is quite complex, isn't it? Because you've already mentioned that some courses or some modules, they may not actually use a keyword or specifically relate to the SDGs, but they are related to the actual SDG themselves. So we need to interpret also the SDG blueprint to a degree. But that's why the idea of learning cafes and meetings and pulling people together and having conversations are so critical in moving this forward, because sending a document and just assuming that everybody will understand it is not the way forward. Can I just share with you with the panelists and the audience what we've actually found in the poll? We've actually found that of those on the call, 30.8% never heard of the blueprint. The similar number have heard of it but not read it. 23% have read it but not used it. And just a small number has actually shared it with colleagues and used it. So I think it goes to say that with Agenda 2030, 8 years ago, we're still relatively young in the process. There's so much going on, obviously, we can see from the Prime Global Forum. So in the last 3 minutes, could I invite each of you, and I'll start with Jill, to say, for those of you wanting to use the blueprint and deepen the SDG integration process, what what would be your word of advice to these colleagues of ours? Jill.
Active question. My advice would be to work through your school strategy and connect your school strategy with Prime using the blueprint. And I particularly, this language issue to me is important, is this translation. Is if you're responsible for Prime, act as a translator and don't force your colleagues to use a language that's not familiar to them when they're already doing fantastic work. If they don't put an SDG label on it, then you help them with the translation, but acknowledge what they're doing and act as the bridge to the strategy.
Christiane.
Thank you. Thank you. For me, the word would be connect. Connect, because I think this is a process that is top down, as Luis said, but also bottom up, right? So connecting all these commitments, all these efforts. Individually, we are perhaps the best to go in depth into our courses, as Alec was interested in, right? And identify what are the SDGs. But if we don't connect and communicate that to others, then it can be lost, right? And also connect to things that are already in the way of being developed and communicated. There are different efforts, so joining forces is better than perhaps try to solve everything by yourself.
Great. Well, thank you, Christiane. And we've got 45 seconds, so I'm going to give you about 20, 25 seconds, Luis. What's your tip, top tip to those tuning in?
Bring awareness by showing that some of the things that we've been doing are addressing the SDGs, and engagement of all community at all different levels.
And engagement. Right, okay. Raise awareness. Okay, well, I think that I can't thank you enough for this wonderful discussion. Actually, I might be misreading the clock, because I think we've got 2 and a bit minutes left. I thought that was a 47-second countdown, but I probably got my timings wrong. So we do have a bit more time. One question that I was thinking of, which perhaps I could actually push out to you, is what resources do you need to support this? So you're talking about raising awareness. We've talked about mapping. We've talked about identifying strengths and weaknesses. What resources do you need, Jill?
Not any time for that, though. But you have to sometimes work with very few resources. I'm quite accustomed to that, and it's now a few years later, and we've got budgets and funding for it. But don't be put off. The enthusiasm and the energy is all part of the resources. But I think Nikolai's saying that we probably have run out of time.
Alec, can I hear you?
We've run out of time. Thank you so much for tuning in, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.